What if the most powerful fighter jets in Europe could be shut down with the press of a button? For decades, European nations have relied on American-made weapons to defend themselves. But now a chilling possibility is sending shockwaves through the continent. Does the US have the power to remotely deactivate Europe's fleet of F-35 fighter jets? Some experts believe it does, and with Donald Trump back in the spotlight, that fear is only growing. A so-called kill switch could allow the US to cripple European air forces overnight, turning their most advanced warplanes into useless hunks of metal. Is this just a paranoid conspiracy or a real threat? Could Trump actually make Europe's F-35s worthless? And if so, what does that mean for the future of European defense? Let's find out. On March 9th, British media outlet The Telegraph published a report examining Trump's potential kill switch threats. It notes that several European officials believe the horde of F-35 fighter jets making their way into Germany over the next few years could be essentially deactivated by Trump. That deal is massive. Germany is committed to buying 35 of the world's most advanced fighter jets in a deal worth over $9 billion. For context, Germany's Air Force has 584 aircraft in total, with 129 of those aerial assets being fighter jets. The arriving F-35s would boost that number to 164, making Germany's Air Force much more powerful. That also means America's F-35s would account for a little under a quarter of Germany's entire Air Force. Trump having a kill switch would be disastrous for Germany. With a single command, he could ground a huge portion of Germany's fighter jets. Or could he? The Telegraph itself notes that there has long been speculation about whether the US can kill the capabilities of its F-35 fighter jets at the press of a button. The idea of having a kill switch seems drastic. It implies that the US sells weapons that it can render inoperable in seconds if it believes one of its allies is getting out of line. Reports of such switches existing have never been confirmed. It would almost seem crazy for them to exist. Just one use of a US kill switch would be enough for all of America's defense clients to stop buying from the US. How could they continue? What army would want to fight with weapons that could be deactivated at a moment's notice? We'll get back to those questions later. For now, the existence of the F-35 kill switch is still a rumor. However, it's a rumor that some in Europe believe to be accurate. Those include Joachim Schranshofer, who's the head of communications at Hensoldt, which is a German arms company. Speaking to the German news outlet Bild in early March, Schranshofer said simply that the existence of an F-35 kill switch was more than just a rumor. He didn't expand on what he meant by this, but the implication is clear. The US could flip a switch and Europe's F-35s would simply stop working. The claims have led several others in Europe to dispute the existence of an F-35 kill switch. Also in early March, Belgium's Chief of Defense General Frederik van Sina rebuked the reports. "We have no indication that this is possible," van Sina told a Belgian newspaper. "The F-35 is not a remote-controlled aircraft. The program relies on worldwide logistical support with spare parts circulating between user countries." The Swiss Department of Federal Defense agrees with van Sina's claims. In a press release dated March 7th, the organization said it's not possible to remotely control or block the F-35A fighter jets, for example by external intervention in the electronics. Switzerland does not need consent if it wants to use its weapon systems or guided missiles for its own defense. It can do this autonomously, independently, at any time. To add to all of these denials, the jet's manufacturer, Lockheed Martin, sent an email to the War Zone, or TWZ, to confront the allegations that a kill switch exists at all. It pointed to the Belgian and Swiss claims to make it clear that Trump doesn't have access to some sort of magical button that could ground the F-35s at a moment's notice, so the problem is solved. Trump's threats can't be carried out because an F-35 kill switch doesn't exist. Multiple European countries and the jet's main manufacturer have confirmed this. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. And to explain why, we only need to look at Ukraine's recent issues with an American-made fighter jet, the F-16. For most of the war, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on his allies to provide F-16s. Those fighter jets, Zelensky believed, would be more than a match for most of the fighters Russia is using in Ukraine. They'd also be vital for air defense. F-16s are fast enough and packed with the right missiles to take out incoming missiles and drones fired into Ukraine from Russia. Europe eventually responded to those calls. By June 2024, a small alliance of European NATO countries agreed to commit 65 F-16s to Ukraine, with the first of those arriving in the country in July 2024. More are set to come, considering that Ukraine's fighter fleet only comprised 69 aircraft as of March 2023, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. That would mean that the incoming F-16s would almost double the size of Ukraine's aerial threat. That was all good news for Ukraine at the time. However, the commitment to provide the US-made fighter jets was made before Trump became president. Trump can't do anything to stop the incoming F-16s from arriving in Ukraine. They're all being supplied by European countries. However, his recent decisions show us that he is able to implement a kill switch of sorts on those jets. This isn't a switch that immediately deactivates the F-16s. Instead, the US can take more subtle approaches to make Ukraine's F-16s far less impactful than they should be. Trump did that in early March when he suspended military aid and intelligence sharing for Ukraine. The former was a problem in its own right for Ukraine's F-16s. It's likely the aid suspension would mean that missiles and other armaments Ukraine could use in its fighter jets wouldn't reach Ukraine. A suspension of intelligence sharing also means that Ukraine can't get the information it needs from its allies, so it can point its F-16s in the right direction when confronting incoming Russian threats. However, the most worrying thing for Ukraine is that Trump's suspension also halted vital support that the F-16's radar jammers require. These jammers exist to prevent Russia's aerial forces from detecting Ukraine's F-16s in the skies until it's too late. They're vital protective measures. Without them, Ukraine's F-16s are essentially sitting ducks. Yes, they are incredibly fast aircraft. However, Russia having the ability to detect them on radar systems means that Putin's forces can aim precision-guided missiles at Ukraine's F-16s, blowing them out of the skies before their pilots can complete their mission. Specifically, the European consortium of countries that provided Ukraine's F-16s tasked the US Air Force to program the ANALQ-131 electronic countermeasures pods installed on the jet's underbellies. That capability is crucial to Ukraine, according to Forbes. It points out that Ukraine began its war with Russia without any significant aerial jammers. The results were disastrous for Ukraine's Air Force. It had to write off around 100 of its Soviet-era MiG and Sukhoi fighters during the first months of Putin's invasion. The arrival of ANALQ-131s delivered much-needed protection for Ukraine's incoming F-16s, allowing them to operate without fear of immediate Russian attack. Forbes also points out that Ukraine's F-16s are capable of using two more American-made defensive systems: the Pylon Integrated Dispenser System, or PIDS, and the Electronic Combat Integrated Pylon System, or ECIPS. PIDS ejects metal chaff and hot flares around the F-16s, which affects incoming radar signals and prevents Russia's infrared-guided anti-aircraft missiles from reaching the aircraft. As for ECIPS, it can host radar jammers and missile warning systems that enable an F-16's pilot to avoid incoming aerial threats. Why do these systems matter? As RBC Ukraine pointed out in a March 9th article, the US suspending its military aid and intelligence also meant that Ukraine's F-16s had to operate without these vital pieces of equipment. It notes that Ukraine has other options. France is currently working on equipping its Mirage 2000 fighter jets with electronic warfare systems before sending them into Ukraine. However, Ukraine's F-16 issues highlights that Trump doesn't need to have access to a kill switch to ground a fighter jet. He can just suspend access to the vital components that the jet needs to operate safely and essentially achieve the same goal. It's worth noting at this point that Trump has lifted his suspension on US aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine for now. But what do Ukraine's issues with its F-16s have to do with an F-35 kill switch? The F-16 situation shows that American-made fighter jets are reliant on US supplies and services to keep them in the air. That's as true for the F-35 as it is for the F-16. An F-35 may not be a remote-controlled jet, as the Swiss pointed out, but it is an aerial system that's heavily reliant on US-controlled logistics chains, maintenance, and computer networks. According to TWZ, every F-35 exported to a European country is subject to strict American controls and is dependent, in operation-critical ways, on support provided by the US government and the contractors responsible for building the aircraft and its many support systems. As TWZ's Tyler Rogaway wrote on X in the wake of reports of the kill switch threats, you don't need a kill switch to severely hamper the utility of an exported weapons system. You just stop providing support for it and it will wither away, some systems very quickly. The more advanced, the faster the degradation. The F-35 is the world's most advanced fighter jet, meaning the withering will be almost instant. Making this worse for Europe is that the jet was conceived as a joint platform. Though it's American-made, it exists precisely because the US worked alongside its NATO allies to make the project possible. The F-35 is the result of a collaborative effort between multiple countries, as a spokesperson for the F-35 JPO told TWZ. That spokesperson's point was that the US alone doesn't control how other countries use their F-35s. He's also attempting to state that the jet being the result of an in-depth collaboration means that the US couldn't stop other countries from using their F-35s by cutting off supporting services. That isn't the case. TWZ notes that Lockheed Martin, along with Pratt & Whitney, retain key data rights to the fighter. The latter supplies the engines that power every F-35 fighter, with their retention of data rights making it difficult, if not impossible, for any other manufacturer to build engines for those jets. Those data rights also create limitations. An F-35 can only be repaired, tweaked, or even undergo routine maintenance at contractor-operated facilities. If those contractors are ordered to stop providing their services to the European users of the jet, we'd start to see the degradation that Rogoway speaks about sooner rather than later. There is no knowledge base whatsoever to do so in the user's country, PWZ noted. And therein lies the problem for Europe. Trump doesn't have access to a direct kill switch. However, he does have some measure of control over the services that jets American manufacturers provide to their partners. Just as we saw with the F-16 becoming less useful to Ukraine when the US briefly cut off aid, we'd see the F-35 become a lame duck. Losing access to basic maintenance would ground many of these extremely complex aircraft. If Trump then decided to prevent manufacturers from providing vital support systems, missiles, and electronic warfare components to Europe's F-35 users, he'd effectively destroy their ability to use the fighter jets they've purchased. Speaking to Defense One, Richard Abulafia of Aerodynamic Advisory gets to the root of the problem. The F-35 was the product of an era of extreme trust, he says, and they, referring to America's European and NATO partners, may never trust the US again if Trump kills support for the system. That brings us to an obvious question. Why would Trump even press this roundabout kill switch in the first place? The answer seems to come down to pressure. That's according to the Telegraph's report on the F-35 kill switch. It says Trump's early March decision to suspend military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine was an attempt to place pressure on Zelensky to begin peace talks with Russia. There may have also been a desire on Trump's part to push Zelensky into resuming talks on a minerals deal between the US and Ukraine. Plus, it's likely no coincidence that the suspension came mere days after the disastrous White House meeting between Trump and Zelensky on February 28th. America's president seemed to be saying to Zelensky that he had to do things Trump's way or lose everything. And it worked. Delegates from Zelensky and Trump's administrations met in Saudi Arabia to hash out the terms of a 30-day ceasefire on March 12th. As of the producing of this video, Putin hasn't accepted the terms of that ceasefire, but that doesn't matter. Trump will feel that his pausing of military aid and the effect it had on Ukraine's F-16s brought Zelensky to the table. America's president also received a promise that Ukraine would resume talks on the minerals deal during that Saudi Arabia meeting. Trump got what he wanted by cutting Ukraine off. Europe will now wonder if he'll pull the same tricks with their F-35s if he feels that those on the continent are getting out of line. The final question is simple. What impact would Trump activating the no supplies kill switch have on Europe? For one, it wouldn't ground Europe's collective air forces. That's not to say losing the F-35 wouldn't have an impact. We mentioned earlier that Germany has 35 of them on the way, which accounts for nearly a quarter of its fighter jet stock. Lockheed Martin also estimates that there will be approximately 600 F-35s operating in Europe by the end of 2035, assuming European countries continue to buy the fighter jet. Norway received 3 more of them in March 2025 alone, with more incoming. Losing those aircraft to a US kill switch would be devastating. Not only would Europe collectively lose important aerial assets, but it would no longer have access to what's widely considered the most advanced fighter jet in the world. The continent's collective threat against Russia and any other enemies would be drastically reduced. But the threat wouldn't disappear entirely. Europe is already working on a 6th-generation fighter jet of its own that could supplant the F-35. Dubbed the Future Combat Air System, or FCAS, the jet is being developed as part of the European Technology Acquisition Program, which sees France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Sweden, and the UK work together on new defense equipment. That jet is nowhere near ready for launch. So far, we've only seen mock-ups of what it might look like. However, it's indicative of a growing trend within Europe to focus on its own defense manufacturing rather than relying on the US for its most advanced weapons system. Trump choosing to kill Europe's F-35s would likely accelerate the work being done on this program. Europe also has its own 4th-generation fighter jets, which are roughly equivalent to America's F-16. These include the Eurofighter Typhoon, which some believe could soon fly over the skies of Ukraine, the French Rafale and Mirage, the Saab Gripen. Again, these are fighters over which the US has no control. They're not as advanced as the F-35. However, they are still powerful enough to ensure Europe maintains an aerial threat even if it loses access to its F-35. That threat just won't be as large as it once was. The US would also experience problems if Trump activated an F-35 kill switch of any description. Though the jet was the result of a collaboration between the US and its European NATO partners, there's no denying that the majority of the manufacturing needed for the jet takes place in the US. Lockheed Martin is its primary manufacturer, with many of its supporting components also being built in the US or by America-approved contractors. Think about what this means from the economic perspective. If Trump kills Europe's F-35s, he will destroy the trust that enabled the platform to exist in the first place. Burned by the US once, European countries would naturally move away from buying F-35s, preferring instead to focus on fighter jets of their own design. Imagine that Germany cancels its contract with Lockheed Martin for the 35 F-35s we mentioned earlier. That amounts to $9 billion of lost contracts right off the bat, and that would only be the start. Each F-35 costs between $82.5 million and $109 million, depending on the model purchased. Lockheed Martin was anticipating having around 600 of them in Europe by 2035. Losing that business would put a multi-billion-dollar hole in the company's bank account, leading to mass layoffs and major issues for the American company. There are hints that European countries are already shying away from the F-35. For instance, Portugal planned to spend around $6 billion on F-35s, intending to use the jets to replace older fighters in its air force. But as Business Insider reported on March 14th, Portugal is getting cold feet over the purchase. US policy uncertainty is to blame, which reflects a prevailing attitude on the continent. Many Europeans don't believe that they can trust the Trump administration to follow through on promises made by the US, either before or during Trump's tenure. They're also watching as Trump decries NATO and goes back and forth on his policies for Ukraine, all of which only adds to the uncertainty. How can those nations cooperate with a country that seems to change its direction on a weekly basis? Perhaps that distrust will be the ultimate kill switch for the F-35 in Europe. The countries using the platform may not be willing to wait around and see if Trump uses America's manufacturing control to apply pressure. They'll just move on, cancelling purchases and relying on European-made fighter jets instead. In addition to the economic problems that could cause for America's defense industry, it would also mean the US loses even more of its influence on a continent where its position has become increasingly shaky in recent months. Trump may not have to press a kill switch on Europe's F-35s at all. The continent may do it for him in the future. But what do you think about the F-35 kill switch dilemma? Would Trump ever go so far as to cut Europe off from access to the key parts and maintenance facilities it needs to keep its F-35s in the air? What would that mean for the future of US and European cooperation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching.